It's my great pleasure to welcome and to introduce to you Dr. Marta Maciniak in this first meeting in the series that we call the American Studies Colloquium. There are postcards, by the way, out in the hallway which give you the schedule for the whole semester, and you can also go to our website and see what else is in the works. Today we have Marta Maciniak, who is a graduate of this department in 2008. Marta graduated from the American Studies Center, and she had then gone on to do doctoral work in the States at University of Buffalo, which is part of the State University of New York. And she graduated with a PhD in 2014. She's just published this year. She's published the book that I understand this must be your dissertation or
based on
your dissertation. The book is called Transnational Punk Communities in Poland, From Nihilism to Nothing Outside Punk. And she's an independent scholar who works in the field of oral history. We just began talking about this, and it sounds very interesting that the work that Marta is doing in oral history. She's right now in Poland as a recipient of a Kościuszko travel grant, and she's doing several things, including, we're very glad to have you here, including the lecture this afternoon. Marta is also a translator and a punk. That's what her bio note says, so that's how I introduce you. So the topic today is Tompkins Square Everywhere, punk as a post-capitalist transnational movement. Welcome. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this introduction. It feels really good to be back and awesome. First of all, I would like to thank Karolina Krasuska for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm very grateful for this opportunity, and I just want to say it feels really good to be back here. Secondly, but no less importantly, I would like to thank Fundacja Kościuszkowska for their generous support of my visit to Poland. Without it, I may not have been able. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Basiuk, for your introduction. I attended your classes, and I remember them really, really nicely from my student days here at Warsaw. Okay, so I will begin by quoting a couple passages from Shelley Fisher-Fishkin's Crossroads of Cultures, the Transnational Turn in American Studies. Her presidential address to the American Studies Association, which she gave on November 12, 2004. While it is a bit dated, I believe it is a good starting point for our discussion of American and Polish punk today, and it may be a good introduction to what I'm trying to do in my work, and to what places like Warsaw are uniquely positioned to do really well. As the transnational becomes more central to American studies, we'll pay increasing attention to the historical roots of multi-directional flows of people, ideas, and goods, and the social, political, linguistic, cultural, and economic crossroads generated in the process. These crossroads might just as easily be outside the geographical and political boundaries of the United States as inside them. You will increasingly interrogate the naturalness of some of the borders, boundaries, and binaries that we may not have questioned very much in the past, and will probe the ways in which they may have been contingent and constructed. As the transnational becomes more central to American studies, we are likely to focus not only on the proverbial immigrant who leaves somewhere called home to make a new home in the United States, but also on the endless process of comings and goings that create familial, cultural, linguistic, and economic ties across national borders. And as you may have noticed, the title of my book actually contains the word transnational. And I wanted to underline that punk is a transnational movement, so it is reflected in the title as well. And just by the way, I forgot to mention that I'm going to give a copy of this book to the Warsaw Library on Monday, probably, because the library will close after I'm done talking to you. But I would like you all to check it out and see what you think, starting Monday, maybe. Okay, so coming back to Fishkin, We are likely to focus less on the United States as a static and stable territory and population whose most characteristic traits it was our job to define, our job as American Studies scholars, and more on the nation as a participant in a global flow of people, ideas, texts, and products, albeit a participant who often tries to impede these flows. Our continued focus on local spaces will attend to the ways in which these spaces participate in global phenomena. Internal and external migrations, the diffusion of cultural forms, the spread of capital and commodities, and all the attendant consequences. So I just wanted to underline that this duality between local and transnational is really important in the punk subculture, because locality is crucial. If you're a punk, you're a member of a local crew, you're known in your city, in your scene, but you're also part of a transnational movement. So this duality is always there. We need to understand the cultural work that forms originating in the United States do in cultures outside this country, studying their reception and reconfiguration in contexts informed by a deep understanding of the countries where that cultural work is taking place. And punk work in Poland has been taking place since around 1978, so we've had a long history already, and there's a lot to talk about, which I try to cover more or less in my book, but only in relation to Warsaw, the vicinity of Warsaw, and Upper Silesia. But I will get to that in a minute. Typically, perhaps for someone coming from Poland, I chose to interrogate these fluid ties between Poland and the United States in the context of punk, a subculture that has nourished and shaped me as I was entering adulthood and going to school in Warsaw. My talk today will be based mainly on the introduction to my book, which I brought with me and which I will donate. Some of this is from the introduction to my dissertation, which is actually slightly different in form, because the publisher made me rearrange the book so that it focuses more exclusively on Poland. I had a ton of research concerning the United States, and that had to be cut out for the book itself. But I am planning a Polish edition. I'm already translating the book, and hopefully the Polish edition will include all of those US parts that I had to cut out for this version. Okay, so in any case, I propose that the United States is the original source of punk, and I do not contest the idea of New York City as a defining center from which punk flowed outward. But I also propose to complicate this view of the American sources of punk to include less central locations, such as, most importantly, Ohio, but also to a lesser extent New Jersey, which borders New York and with which it is in many ways inextricably linked. The advantages of this complication are numerous. It allows us to understand more about how the centers we already consider crucial have developed, thanks to and not in spite of their connections with their peripheries. The relationship between the core and its periphery or peripheries is reciprocal. Usually there is an exchange of blood. Cultural agents often move from the periphery to the center, but that is not always true. And more importantly, the conditions in which and reasons why they choose to stay in the periphery should also be of interest to us. The mechanisms of functioning in the in-between spheres or in the periphery, but far from isolation, can also uncover rich insight, as might the point of view from the periphery out to the center, and vice versa. Okay, so I wanted to show you just a brief view of a punk map of North America on which I based my research. It is really personal and based on the interests which are expressed in my book, because obviously there's many more centers and communities connected with punk throughout the United States, but I just wanted to underline the ones that I focused on. On the East Coast, you can see Boston, which is connected since the mid-'80s with a really strong street punk / oi scene. I don't write about it that much in my book, but there are connections, of course. I just wanted to point out that the East Coast is really important, despite the fact that most American punk bands that are well known in Poland actually come from the West Coast. But New York City obviously is where I did most of my research for the US part. DC was important for hardcore in the 80s. Cleveland is, just as we enter the Midwest, a really important center, which I will focus on a little bit later. Gainesville in Florida, I just put that up there because I wanted to underline to you that in the 90s, punk has split into so many different subgenres, and one of them was ska punk. And perhaps some of you know the Gainesville scene, of which the most important band is Less Than Jake, that I had the occasion to see many times when I was living in the States. And on the so-called left coast, we start out from the north, Vancouver, Canada, a really important spot, from which two bands, one of them more connected with Poland than the other one, come. So the first one is DOA, which played a really big role in the 80s because of their connection with the ZZ. And the other one, the Real Mackenzies, who play in Poland all the time, and there's other bands who come from Vancouver to Europe all the time as well. And San Francisco and LA. Just one point on LA, Youth Brigade, the first American punk band that ever came to Poland in 1985, the first American punk band to tour Poland was from LA in 85, and the second one was DOA. Okay, so Poland is a country where punk has been around for a long time already, reaching it primarily from England, but also from the United States, and where it has produced an array of attitudes, scenes, and local legends. These local communities offer a good vantage point to examine the next axis of my inquiry in my research, locality versus transnationality. So I decided to focus on two different scenes in both Poland and the US. One considered central and primary in terms of the overall development of the subculture. In Poland, these were New York, in the US, they were New York, and in Poland it was Warsaw. And another, a less obvious area, not previously discussed in published accounts of punk, except as footnotes to the main narratives. So my choices for the US were Ohio, so eloquently introduced by John Savage in his England's Dreaming, the Sex Pistols and Punk Rock, and in Poland it was Upper Silesia. Because despite what Remigiusz Kasprzycki wrote in his book published 2 years ago, there always was a vibrant scene in Upper Silesia, and there still is, in case somebody doesn't know. They have allowed me to explore the development of punk in new and previously lesser known contexts that provide valuable perspectives on how the subculture operates on the ground with different infrastructures, social makeups, and cultural expectations. So now a bit on my methodology, which was a combination of oral history and participant observer or insider ethnography. Here is what my mentor at the University at Buffalo, Dr. Michael Frisch, had to say about the practice of oral history. Memory is living history, the remembered past that exists in the present. In one sense, it is a force that can be tapped, unleashed, and mobilized through oral and public history to stand as an alternative to impose orthodoxy and officially sanctioned versions of historical reality. It is a route to a broadly distributed authority for making new sense of the past in the present. But in another way, memory is a deeply cultural artifact, manipulated in a host of direct and indirect ways, especially in an age of mass mediation, to reproduce culturally appropriate attitudes and behaviors. It can thus stand as a prop of cultural power and authority, unless challenged in a variety of ways, of which aggressive historical inquiry and public presentation is certainly one. The kind of manipulation of history that my mentor mentioned here is the domain of politicians, especially those in power or those aiming to seize it. But as he suggests, this power can also be seized by forces that do not exhibit this opportunistic drive, but rather intend to make new sense of the past for the good of the present and the future. I think this passage applies to punk and to its history because punk reproduces culturally inappropriate attitudes and behaviors, and in the process unmasks those that are appropriate, but corrupt or implicated in unjust power structures. In addition, punk above all encourages people to think independently and to question and rethink what society teaches as moral and desirable. And I apologize, but the order of the slides is slightly disorderly. So here's a picture that goes with what I'm saying right now. It's a photo that I took on the premises of the now defunct Elba squat in Warsaw. Maybe some of you went there. It's probably my favorite picture ever, and it indicates that there is no established truth or authority that you should be afraid to expose or defraud. I will now outline about one more slide about Upper Silesia. It's just another one of my favorite pictures that I took during my fieldwork research. This was taken in Żory, at the bus stop, and it just says it's what we call in Polish a wlepka. And it says Górny Śląsk because when I open my eyes, I love what I see. Okay, so now I will outline some of the important perspectives that need to be underlined before we delve into our little introduction into the book and my research. Punk is by definition transnational, which we've mentioned before. Punk is about the unity of struggle and has much to do with certain postmodern movements for social justice. Punk helps us understand what's happened to Polish society in the 80s and beyond, and the same for what's happened to American society and American urban life in the same way. So what follows is a discussion, or something like it, from cut up and reassembled parts of my manuscript. So, about the roots of punk. It was first born in New York and in Cleveland, more or less at the same time, around 1973. Then it took the shape by which it is most recognizable today, the picture postcard type of London, AD 1977, making this the magical and commonly accepted start date, a mythical year zero for punks everywhere, even though, like me, many punks know better. However, the roots of punk go back to other time periods and other places on the globe, making it by nature and by definition transnational as well as fiercely local. One step removed was the Warhol Silver Factory in New York in the years 65-67, and its spin-offs in the form of the New York Dolls, surviving until 1974. More or less parallel to the New York phenomenon of these so-called proto-punk bands, there existed a movement called Situationism in France, which is often credited with laying the philosophical groundwork for punk, alongside anarchism. Situationism flourished in the mid to late 60s, culminating in the Paris May Revolt in 1968. All of these developments bore fruit in the original American setting of the punk saga, centered on the club CBGBs. Here is one of the numerous thought-provoking quotes featured in the book CBGB and Omfag, published in 2005 as part of an effort to save the club from closing. Unfortunately, the effort failed. CBGB was a rock and roll epicenter, and we were interested in ideas. Nobody was there for the money, because nobody had any, and nobody cared. This comment has to do with the notion of failure as the defining punk experience. You're punk, therefore you are born to lose. From another song title by Johnny Thunders. You are born to lose, but you have nothing, so you have nothing to lose. Economic poverty and the deep realization of systemic economic inequities in American society was therefore a defining trait of punk roots. I found it very inspiring when the American ethnomusicologist Kelly Tatro stated in her work on Mexican punk that poverty itself is a form of violence. In fact, many people in the punk scene and beyond believe that it is poverty and the extreme inequality of wealth distribution that fuels the Mexican drug cartel's power. She came to this conclusion also by comparing her own observations with the ethnographic work of Philippe Bourgeois, who classified it as a structural violence in his ethnographic work on El Salvador and the US inner city. Tatro mentioned the obstacles punks faced in their attempts to attend and graduate from college, as well as to find fulfilling jobs outside what she calls the effective and ethical work they performed in and for the punk community, compounded by the physical abuse they regularly received from the police. So just to pause for a moment, because I'm probably going a bit too fast, and just to go back to the subtitle actually of my book, From Nihilism to Nothing Outside Punk. Tatra talked a lot about the kinds of work that punks perform, especially she focused on singers. And she called that work effective and ethical, because in fact they were working. Punk bands are, even though they mostly don't get paid, so it's not really remunerated work, but it's work for the community. And within the punk community, other kinds of work are also performed, concerning the organization of shows and other things that need to be arranged. Okay, Polish cultural studies scholar Mirosław Pęczak describes punk as a phenomenon on the borderline between the subculture and the social movement. Tatro disagrees that punk is like a social movement. In order to fully address this analytical question, let me quote from her a little bit more. Schanz characterizes most social movement theory as being still grounded in a Keynesian social citizenship state, rather than the neoliberal crisis state, in which, he posits, social movements actually operate today. In the early 20th century, social movements in advanced capitalist nations focused on demanding equal rights from the state, through statist or reformist or integrative movements and strategies, which inherently validated the state, asking for its protection. As opposed to a Keynesian state operating through the Fordist organization of the social factory, however, Schanz argues that modern neoliberal nations are defined by crisis. That crisis is a dominant characteristic of postmodern, late capitalist, first world societies today, few would disagree. Since the 60s, economic crises and depressions have occurred in the United States and Western European countries like clockwork. Punk in England appeared during an economic crisis in the mid-70s. Ireland and Northern Ireland have been in permanent social, economic, and political crisis until the 90s, due to brutal conflicts over ties with the UK and due to religious issues as well as lingering economic problems. England itself, owing to unprecedented immigration from its former colonies after World War II, has had to face difficult questions about the cultural identity of its citizens, and subcultures here have been right at the heart of those developments. I'm not sure if you know what I'm talking about, what kinds of immigration to the UK in the 60s especially, from the West Indies. And this was important for subcultures for the sole reason of the birth of the skinhead movement in the late 60s, which was inspired by Jamaican rude boys in England. So the crisis, I was already there. The situation in Poland has also been plagued by crisis since World War II. Despite the reconstruction of the country's cities, notably the phoenix-like rebirth of Warsaw from the ashes of the uprising in '44, and the relative modernization of the countryside, every decade has seen Polish people rise up in demand for bread and for freedom. Not coincidentally, and in true punk style, Kryzys became the name of one of our first and most important punk bands. Punk has always been a response to crisis and to the idea of crisis as such. In her analysis of punk in light of postmodern social movements, Tatro underlines its ties to communities that could be called transfer cultures, based primarily on late 20th century and 21st century forms of anarchism, related to the anti-globalist movement, such as Bookchin's individualist anarchisms, overly concerned with individual freedoms, leading to a decadent form of anarchism that resulted not in revolutionary change, but only in elitist subculture. Despite the reservations of scholars writing about punk contemporarily, I propose to stick to the term subculture, which is elitist in the sense that it is not apologetic for its profane aspects that Tatra also discusses at length, and because it often views the mainstream with the same contempt with which it is usually viewed from the outside. I then propose to continue to use the term subculture rather than social movement, while bearing in mind that it exhibits several characteristics of a social movement, traditionally understood, because admittedly it transcends the scope of traditionally understood subcultures, especially youth or criminal subcultures, while exhibiting much of the drive and seriousness of a social movement. Okay, I'm going to skip a little bit here. There's more about subculture, but you can read about it in the introduction. So coming back to that moment in the 70s when punk as we know it today was born. Probably the greatest urbanist thinker that the United States has ever produced, Jane Jacobs, established her theory of urbanism while living in Greenwich Village, which is just a few blocks away from where CBGB's used to be. It is thanks to her personal efforts and the efforts of people like her that we do not have an expressway running right through Lower Manhattan today. She taught us resistance to the destruction of life. She gloriously reaffirmed, in utter punk fashion and against all sensible beliefs, that streets are where kids grow up and that it's okay. Even in the middle of the night, the street is safe, because this very knowledge that her street's life is inexhaustibly rich, beyond her or anyone's power to grasp, helps her sleep well. Marshall Berman notes that this belief in city streets is actually one of the oldest themes in modern culture, and that this urban romance crystallized around the street, which emerged as a primary symbol of modern life. No wonder even Polish punks and skinheads of the 90s were not immune. They too know the magic of their streets and declare that they will defend them, as the Analogs did in the song Prowadź mnie ulico, Lead Me, O Street. We will never give up our streets. We will never give up our cities. This is where everything ends and where everything starts. This is the only place where time will flow. In fact, a whole subgenre of punk became called street punk because of this fascination with the urban romance. From casual observation as well as from painful living experience, it's easy to pinpoint what makes punks and skins want to fight for their streets. In the American context, there was no other place like the Bowery, when the Bowery was still itself. Now the Bowery is gone, and it may just as well be called road like any other road. That is why to have a 7-Eleven in St. Mark's Place feels like utter defeat. And that is why the residents and activists of Alphabet City were waging a struggle to stop the franchise from entering their neighborhood, one of the few left without the incursion of the chain store giant in the greater New York area, when I last visited in 2013. The Lower East Side, one of the most legendary New York neighborhoods on the edge of which CBGB's was located, has seen an incredible transformation, from the Bowery starting out as the bustling theater and music hall mecca of the turn of the century, through the seedy underworld of the last 2 decades of the elevated trains in the 40s and 50s, through the emerging Loisaida being the home of the most prominent underground musicians of the 60s, to the twilight zone of the 70s, to the continuing disintegration of city services in the 80s, to the great battles of the early 90s, and finally its complete makeover into a gentrified safe zone for those with large inheritances at the turn of the 21st century until now. When the Ramones first entered the neighborhood with their roller coaster speed acts in 1974, They were part of a larger migration from everywhere outside Manhattan. These migrants came from nearby Brooklyn, Queens, New Jersey, like Patti Smith, or Ohio, like the Dead Boys, John Morton or Peter Laffner. And despite appearances, the transition from the outer boroughs to Manhattan often proved harder than that from anywhere else. Said Danny Fields, the first manager of the Ramones. I understand the Ramones much better now because I realized they and I made the same journey. To cross that river is much easier than to cross that river, he adds, pointing first to the Hudson separating New York from the mainland, then to the East River. If you come across the Hudson River from Potato Salad, Idaho, you're a little infusion of America, and we can handle that. But if you come across the East River from Brooklyn or Queens, like I did and the Ramones did, you're bridge and tunnel. That transition isn't easy. The Ramones were the ultimate outsiders. They were too much for America, and they were almost too much for New York. They were just too outside. Perhaps they were too much because they were a little too traditional in their love of rock and roll, sticking to their own solid formula throughout their existence as a band. New York as the ultimate modern city must, but must it really, chase its own tail and perpetually abandon its past for the sake of its future? Another quote from Marshall Berman, who was writing in the early 80s. Among the many images and symbols that New York has contributed to modern culture, one of the most striking in recent years has been the image of modern ruin and devastation. The Bronx, where I grew up, has even become an international code word for our epoch's accumulated urban nightmares: drugs, gangs, arson, murder, terror, thousands of buildings abandoned, neighborhoods transformed into garbage and brick-strewn wilderness. For 10 years, through the late 50s and early 60s, the center of the Bronx was pounded and blasted and smashed. Berman used to stand on the Grand Concourse with his friends and watch the vistas of devastation stretching for miles to the east and west, as far as the eye could see, and marveled to see our ordinary nice neighborhood transformed into sublime, spectacular ruins. Only there was no humanistic triumph here to offset the destruction. Indeed, when the construction was done, the real ruin of the Bronx had just begun. Let me just check on my time, because I tend to go over. What was not destroyed in an organized and publicized effort by the authorities, like the blocks below Canal Street and the Bronx, was left to the desolation characteristic of the Lower East Side, a result of a deliberate but unofficial policy called planned shrinkage, a callous policy of encouraging neighborhood decline by radically reducing essential services, especially firefighting. A largely successful bid to push an expandable and potentially troublesome population out of the urban center and make way for a new class. In the 80s, Lower East Side activists would dub the strategy spatial deconcentration. Planned shrinkage was combined with a swing away from the late 60s war on poverty type respect and attention given the underprivileged, at least in theory, if not always in practice. On the Lower East Side, activist Bill Weinberg states, "In the aftermath of a violent incident involving hippies and Puerto Ricans on Memorial Day 1967 in Tompkins Square Park, a judge was to say, 'This court will not deny equal protection to the unwashed, unshod, unkempt, and uninhibited.'" But in the 80s, and especially in the 90s, this would have been unheard of, except from the lips of the squatter's lawyer, Stanley Cohen, who has tirelessly represented the people of New York against the authorities for decades now. He still stands strong today, yelling "Tompkins Square everywhere" from the platform of the anniversary show in the park in 2013, despite the almost complete makeover of that neighborhood and the park itself have undergone since the riots in 1988. So I just wanted to show you this really short clip of Stanley from 2013. It was the anniversary show, that is always held every year in the beginning of August to commemorate the riots from 1988-89.
Us, as long as you tell the truth. And in the position in New York City, you've had a lot of problems with telling the truth the last 20, 25 years.
He's addressing the cops right now who are watching the show.
And we know right now that even you are not representing your own police captains for attacks recently on Occupy Wall Street. Over 20 years ago, I stood in this park when this community rose up and said no more to police occupation, no more to attacks on the homeless, no more to attacks on the squatters, no more putting out fire barrels, and all hell broke loose. And at the end of that battle, we won, you lost, you went home, no donuts. For 2 years we fought in the courts, we fought in the streets, and as it turns out, 20 years later, we're bigger and better than ever. Whether it's Black Bloc, whether it's Occupy Wall Street, whether it's Anonymous, whether it's Hamas on the Gaza Strip, whether it's movements in Oakland, whether it is Fight Back all over the country. This park for over 120 years has stood to resist, has stood against powerful institutions, powerful entities, the military, the police, and enemies of freedom and free speech. And here we are 120 years later, and we're still here, and we'll still demonstrate, and long after the cops, and long after the army, and long after Yes We Can are on pension and gone, our children and our grandchildren will still be fighting and still be yelling, Tompkins Square everywhere. Thank you, resist!
And the destruction of the Lower East Side that began in the late 60s was more widespread, long-lasting, and haunting than that of Soho, because it not only remained in place, but also spread like fire. Crime was commonplace throughout, especially drug trafficking, drug abuse, and prostitution. Again, I have to cut down a little bit because I realize that I'm running out of time slightly. But basically, what happened in the 80s is, I'm sure you've learned in many of the courses here, there was deindustrialization in New York and a switch to the fire economy for finance, insurance, and real estate, which caused an effective disenfranchisement of the working class, a surge in homelessness, and the fact that already marginal areas such as the Lower East Side were hardest hit. And continuous immigration, especially from Puerto Rico, created conditions that were just getting worse over time because there was no jobs for these people moving into New York. Right around that time, in the 80s, one of the most popular superheroes of all time, Batman of DC Comics, was reimagined, and from then on, his story has been rid of the earlier 60s corniness and instead presented as the Dark Knight saga. The lone hero whose personal life was destroyed by crime, who lives in the city of Gotham, obviously modeled after New York, which is basically run by the mob, and where such qualities as kindness and honesty are basically inexistent. The hero cannot get over the fact that his parents were killed in a robbery, and neither can he give up this truly hopeless fight against the crime choking his city. This rewriting of Batman's story as an almost Greek-style tragedy, the hero cannot give up the fight, even though he knows that he cannot win, and the fight overtakes his entire life, coincided with the real downfall of old New York. One should not forget that many punks, like the creators of Punk magazine, who chronicled the heyday of the CBGB scene, the Ramones, Blondie, and even more 80s and later punks, were also nerds steeped in the culture of comic books, cartoons, TV shows, and B-movies. But coming back to the reality on the streets of Alphabet City specifically, what neither the city nor the landlords anticipated was that first, the neighborhood's residents, mainly first and second generation Latino immigrants and some African Americans in the 70s, And then in the mid-80s and 90s, punks and anarchists from New York and beyond would pull together to organize against this planned destruction in two ways. In the 70s, two separate but connected movements were started by the neighborhood's residents. The first was homesteading in the abandoned and warehoused former tenements. This homesteading was nothing else but the first wave of squatting. The second way was through community gardens, which sprang up on the lots previously occupied by tenements, which were torched or turned into rubble. Today, some of these buildings that were squatted by the original homesteaders can be identified by their fire escapes, which were painted blue to commemorate the neighborhood's history. What is surprising about the history of squatting on the Lower East Side, or Loisaida, is that there is such a disconnect between its various chapters, such as between the homesteading movement of the 70s and the later waves, but above all between the more recent histories of punk and skinhead squads that were sometimes organized in the same building successively. It is in the mid-80s that punk squatting became very common in Loisaida, and there was a whole punk block on the East 8th Street between avenues B and C, with endless partying and a feeling of freedom that was unfortunately not meant to last long. The various groups that undertook the practice of squatting since the 80s appear to have done it without much cooperation or even knowledge of one another. Perhaps the most surprising of these disconnects is part of the history of the squat on the north side of 9th Street between avenues C and D. First occupied by skinhead squatters, which today sounds like a contradiction in terms, but is a historical fact. Then by punks, the two groups having no idea that one was succeeding the other, as I was told by Doug Glass, a resident of C Squad and neighborhood oral historian. There is also a lot of beautiful photography out there, if you're interested, in the form of both publications and online exhibits that documents Loisaida's troubles and transformation over the past decades. Especially stunning pictures of inside the interiors of squats are available online on various newspapers' sites, for example. And just to underline that these squats are now inexistent because there was a UHAB deal at the beginning of the 2000s, and basically there's only 11 squats left in Lower Manhattan. So the two best known venues that evolved out of squats in this part of New York were C Squat on Avenue C between 9th and 10th, and ABC No Rio on Rivington Street. And people came from New Jersey and Connecticut to see shows over there. And for example, there was a Lithuanian immigrant, Gedas, who I interviewed. He now lives in C Squad, and he used to go there to shows in the 90s when he was a kid. Therefore, while gentrification was already becoming a dirty word and regular people who read the daily press knew about it in the 80s, as Neil Smith describes in his book, simultaneously another phenomenon was happening that was a counterforce to it, and it was mostly limited to the Lower East Side, although squatting also occurred in the Bronx. It is important to note that punk was instrumental in the squatting movement in New York since the 80s, and it has given it a distinct flavor. Of no small importance is also the fact that squatting in New York appears to have brought together a diverse group of activists and desperate people of various ethnicities and genders. While the first wave of squatting was mainly dominated by Puerto Ricans, the most numerous ethnic group in Loisaida, the punks were mostly white kids from both New York and surrounding areas, while some of them were immigrants or second-generation immigrants, like Gedas. In the early to mid-90s, the new authorities under the leadership of Giuliani have unleashed a crackdown on the Lower East Side squatting scene. Numerous evictions and demolitions followed without regard to the concept of sweat equity, which Doug Glass underlined. It's like the basis for what squatters were doing. Sweat equity, meaning they were putting their own sweat and labor into the buildings and therefore earning the right to occupy them. instead of buying them. But in the end, the squads that survived were forced to basically purchase the buildings that they were occupying. It was supposedly for a symbolic $1 from the city, but now they have regular bank loans that they have to pay off, which is like, but whatever. If you are interested in seeing video footage of the process of demolishing some of the squads, I recommend a documentary available on Vimeo called Your House is Mine. In any case, there was police and tanks involved, and even the cultural institution of ABC No Rio, a gallery and concert space, was threatened by both eviction and demolition, which was luckily averted thanks to a sit-in strike. The space now houses a large punk scene library on the second floor and the concert venue on the first, with punk matinees a Sunday staple for decades now. Okay, so I'm pretty sure that you're familiar with the Tompkins Square Park riots. I don't have to go over that in '88 and '89. So just to gloss over them really quickly. Neil Smith, for example, calls what happened a police riot, with police charging down the street like Cossacks and basically inflaming the problem even more. And I had a really interesting interview with Pani Łucja, known as Lucy, who runs the bar called Lucy's Bar, but also known as Blanche's Tavern on Tompkins Square. And she has some really interesting stories to tell about the time of the riots when, for example, once she had to barricade herself in because some of the people who sought refuge were running away from the police, and she had to barricade herself in and stuff like that. But anyway, after the riots, as Neil Smith underlines, the protesters who were yelling "Die, Yappie scum" and other class war and other slogans like that, they have not given up, and they've taken up the slogan "Tompkins Square everywhere," which you heard from Stanley Cohen, as a sign of an ambitious political geography of revolt, into which punk has inscribed itself with all the squads and the cultural underpinnings of the whole geography, basically. So squatting must be understood in this context, not as a lifestyle phenomenon removed from real issues of an urban environment. Homelessness and squatting, the struggle for fair housing in the old cities of late capitalist societies, go hand in hand. But the problem with squatting generally is its inherent impermanence. It generally has an expiration date, which happened obviously to most of the Manhattan squats. So like I said, the 11 remaining Loisaida squats that were not demolished are currently operating under the UHAB deal. Only one is still trying to find a different solution in the courts. Okay, but today there is a large scene of Latino punks and skinheads based mainly around secret venues like the Acheron or the Swamp, recently turned into a recording studio exclusively, which are both located in the Latino neighborhood between East Williamsburg and Bushwick in Brooklyn. So it appears that history has come full circle today in this small respect, and because while there's only one illegal squat that remains in Alphabet City, most of the venues operating in Brooklyn are of an illegal or semi-legal nature. That is, with no licenses required by the city for entertainment or the sale of alcohol. And I have attended some shows at the Swamp, and basically the way it works there is there is no signs on the door. It's upstairs, you have to climb along a staircase, and if the police comes, they barricade themselves in, and of course they do sell alcohol inside, but it's illegal. So in any case, what I would like to underline at this point is that punk played and continues to play an important role in one of the seminal struggles of the late 20th century, the struggle for housing and democratic uses of public space in late Western capitalist societies. and is not ignorant of the struggles of the post-Cold War migration between the United States, Latin America, and Central and Eastern Europe. Actually, you can also add England to this transnational migration trend since World War II and since the 60s especially. This migration brings with it the awareness of various aspects of punkness that are not so evident in Middle American punk lives. So I'm trying to tell you here that punks living in the Midwest, for example, may not have had any experience of things like punks living in New York City, which is not true of, for example, Upper Silesian punks as opposed to Warsaw punks. But that's just an aside. And things I mean are, for example, anti-Nazism or the involvement in the animal rights movement, which is still not developing as fast in the US overall as it is in Europe, but also in many Latin American punk communities. So because there's so many Latino punks in New York, there's a greater awareness of animal rights, of anti-Nazis, and all that stuff. The efforts and actions of this diverse group of punk squatters are also sometimes appreciated by the non-squatting and non-alternative populations, as during the October 2012 crisis caused by Hurricane Sandy, when C-Squat was the only place in the neighborhood that had a generator, and also organized a free cookout, courtesy of years and years prior of organizing Food Not Bombs, right out in the street on Avenue C. And I think I have a slide for that. Oh, here's an interior shot of C-Squad on the staircase, and when they were doing the cookout for Hurricane Sandy victims. Coming back to the main subject at hand, I'm going to wrap up shortly. We need to spend a few moments discussing punk's character in this period of time as a result of these defining circumstances. In Loisaida, the early 80s was the time when no one had any illusions about what had happened to their neighborhood, and the kids who lived there created New York hardcore, more or less at the same time that the new wave of punks in England found their strength through Oi. This parallel is, I think, really important. These new punks, many still teenagers, lived in a series of squats and abandoned storefronts near Tompkins Square Park, where they formed bands, grubbed out a living, and fought vicious battles on the avenues with local thugs who viewed a gang of punk kids as, well, another gang. Beaten and bruised, the young punks traded spiky hair and leather jackets for a more combat-ready look. Steel-toe boots, chain belts, shaved hands, and toughened up punk music the same way. There's no justice, it's just us, yelled Roger Merritt of Agnostic Front, who split from Manhattan as a teenager to live in basements and squats. They wanted to distinguish themselves from earlier punk and therefore called themselves hardcore. That was old Andy Warhol stuff, said Merritt, just artsy. We were rougher kids living in the streets. It had a rougher edge. Which brings us to the concept of unity, so important to for the punk movement today. And here's what Joe Strummer, singer of The Clash, had to say about the Ramones, who were still performing at the time when hardcore was born. They were actually performing until the mid-90s. And together they made this incredible thing that influenced everybody, no doubt about it. We want to see unity on the stage. That takes us out of our individuals, wandering around in life, bumping up against obstacles, not getting anywhere. That's why groups are so powerful. It makes us think better of ourselves as a species. I think the Ramones gave the youth of the world a lot of self-respect. Strummer saw the key elements in the Ramones that were appealing to the youth of the world and gave them a lot of self-respect. Perhaps it would be wise at this point to take a cue from Jello Biafra, who once commented about the time when the Dead Kennedys were starting out. They were a hardcore punk band from California who were part of the same generation as Agnostic Front. There was no new school, there was no old school. We were trying to blow up the school. This indicates an affinity despite stylistic differences that Miret mentioned, and a mutual understanding of the conditions that need blowing up, including, for example, the walls put up by the music industry, barring the first Ramones album from airplay and the general closing up of opportunities for punk bands that sparked off the creation of the sprawling DIY underground of the 80s. The other clue taken from Strummer is the cue about the youth of the world discovering their strength thanks to this American invention in the form of Ramones-style punk. There were numerous personal connections, which I'm sure you know about, between New York and London scenes in the 70s, especially when you look at the couple Sid Vicious and Nancy Spungen, which is really famous. But in turn, the punk explosion in England was so powerful that it transformed and reinvigorated punk in the US. Quote from England's Dreaming about what happened when the Sex Pistols came to play their first tour of the United States, which turned out their last tour to be their last tour ever. It was so weird, says Legs McNeil. I was hanging out with the Ramones in LA, so I watched them come across America as they toured, and I watched the kids skin their heads in that week. The audiences changed overnight. The kids got it off the TV. The Ramones were great. It was Rocket to Russia, and it looked like they were going to take off too, but then along came the Sex Pistols and ruined the Ramones too. At the same time, when this was happening all across the US, January 1978, punk was also already spreading in Poland. The first bands in Warsaw and Gdańsk were started by fans of Lou Reed and television. You can tell by the sound. In 78-79, there were about 100 punks in Poland, according to legend. They took their inspiration from foreign music magazines, e.g. the German Bravo, and records brought from the West, as well as from other punks. Their colorful presence on the streets of People's Poland was like a breath of fresh air, a significant injection of freedom that was happening totally independently of politically compromised and culturally loaded phenomena like the Solidarity movement. Although the interactions between the punks and Solidarity are a very interesting subject in itself, which I do tackle in my research, so if you're interested in this particular subject, go to the book. From the perspective of punks only, I didn't get to talk to former members of Solidarity. So just two more quick notes before I end. Squatting in Poland developed in the 90s, and American bands started coming to Poland after '89, obviously, in larger and larger numbers. Notably, the Silesian DIY promoter Fakir, who was then singer of 7 Godzin Snu and owner of the enigmatic label, brought Awkward Death and No Redeeming Social Value from Queens over to play in Silesia and elsewhere in Poland. And in the spring of 2012, the late great squad by the name Elba in Warsaw was finally really evicted for good. While the eviction, as usual, had the nasty aspects of a police state being born, there was a positive aspect to it as well. Like Stanley Cohen's screaming Tompkins Square everywhere, bands performed at a goodbye show there with strength and conviction that the spirit of Elba will remain alive. In fact, one of the bands performing that night changed the lyrics to one of their live favorites, to which the new chorus went, "Elba stays with us." And although that was just wishful thinking, a new squad was born in Puławska Street a couple of years later and is now becoming a new hub of activity alongside another squad downtown, for which battles are waged like clockwork each November 11th. Like Cohen, we must continue to say no, just like Jane Jacobs taught us in her writing and in her activism, and just like the Polish punk Deserter warned us in their song Poster. Somewhere far away, people are afraid to go out on the street and say no. Where is that? Where is that? We must react to those first sounds, warning us of an unwarranted takeover of our cities, so imperceptibly planned by those in power, so that it can be prevented, unlike in Lysaida, which was reborn, but as something else. So I encourage you to read the story of how punk developed in Poland, a part of which is in this book. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's time for comments and questions.
Please, if you have any.
Should I turn the lights on, maybe?
Oh, and just one more note, I didn't get to it in the actual talk, but I really need to continue my research on Polish skinheads in New York. This is a picture taken by actually an art photographer who found a group of Polish skinheads in gyms, actually, in New York City, and he photographed them. So it really inspired me to get to that subject as well, sometime in the future, hopefully. Any questions? Yep.
Thanks, this was really interesting.
Thank you.
I was wondering, it seems that, I mean, starting about your definition of punk, because it seems to be like an umbrella category which tends to consume everything. For example, when you use the term the Lower East Side exchangeably with Loizada, you know where the term Loizada comes from, right?
Yes, from the Puerto Rican immigration.
Yeah, the Puerto Ricans are gone from your, even when you talk about the change and the transformation of the Lower East Side, they're not part of it. And most likely the local thugs that the punks were fighting were probably the Latino kids, yes. So I'm curious, and this is of course always the question about these kinds of subcultures and their relation to the so-called locals. Ways in which we tend to consume the local histories when we talk about those, revolutionaries. But even within the context of the subculture, the ABC No Rio is not just punk, and actually neither is Elba or Cinema or Ada or any of the Warsaw squats. They're also not just punk. These are mixes of different subcultures. So what we're talking about seems to be more than just punk, but the urban subculture. Yeah, okay, that's my question.
Because punk is connected to so many other subcultures and really relevant social issues. So obviously hubs like Ada or ABC No Rio, of course many artists were involved with ABC No Rio, for example John Morton, who was both a punk musician and an artist, a visual artist. So obviously it's all connected, and some of the Latino kids, like I said, many Latino kids today are punks, especially in Brooklyn. So again, well, when we look at the Lower East Side today, these issues are much less relevant, only in the form of like the Morris Museum of Reclaimed Urban Space, which was created at C Squad. They are trying to reinvigorate the memory of the struggles and stuff like that, but squatting in Manhattan is basically dead.
As they're paying off their,
Exactly.
credit
Bank
now,
account,
which
yeah.
is just the absurdity.
Yeah, part of the deal was actually to create a storefront business, which is the museum. But they do some really interesting stuff, movie screenings, so it is continued in this new form. And they sometimes do shows too, but very occasionally. So I'm not sure if I really
No, I'm just
answered.
curious what's punk, what's specific about punk in this context.
Well, basically punks were some of the organizers of these cultural events in the 80s. They were the squatters themselves. They organized shows in order to raise money to save the abandoned buildings or to renovate them and stuff like that. So they were just part of the overall effort to save the neighborhood in the 80s. And today, we have to, I guess, think of the individualist anarchisms that Bookchin was writing about. And take some of the critique of this new style of anarchism, individualist anarchism. It's connected with elitism and just the fact that punk doesn't really want to be a social movement. It wants to be connected in the animal rights struggle, but only a part of the punks, because a lot of the punks just ridicule vegetarianism as an idea and are opposed to it. And then there's the hardcore kids who, many of them are straight edge, they are really engaged in the animal rights struggle, which is a growing movement, especially in Europe. So there's a lot of contradictions within punk itself. It's not uniform in any way. Actually, the easiest way to explain why this is, because it's based on paradox. It's built on many paradoxes. So it's really hard to define what punk is. So I'm trying to do it in this book, and I try to skip some of my discussion of what I think it is, because it's just a lot of theorizing. But there's so many niches in punk that you can get engaged in, like the animals' rights struggle, feminism, or the squatting movement, which sort of encompasses, Or you can be apolitical, you can be closer to the skinheads, and just not go to squats at all. I know people like that too, who refuse to go to shows at squats because squats are dirty, but they still consider themselves punks, especially older punks from the 80s. They are offended when they go to a squat and they see a red star or something like that. So it's all complicated. Especially generationally. The generational differences are big. When you interview punks who were kids in the 80s, their perspective is much different from kids today on such issues, especially squatting.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Yep.
Yeah, it's related, because I also had an impression that you talked about punk as this unified phenomenon. And I would like to ask you for a clarification about the beginnings, because you insisted on that being a US phenomenon. But then in the US it has an element of the beat movement in it, an element of Timothy Leary's philosophy, depending on which location you choose as a punk center. So I wanted to ask you about the element of the commercial element and the Malcolm McLaren bit. How strongly does that feature in the history of punk in the US as you try to narrate it? And the reason why I'm asking about this is because with my very poor knowledge of the punk culture, I always thought of the 80s as this aesthetic movement with a very strong dystopian element, but also a very strong commercial element of a fashion among youngsters, of just saying no without a specific object of the no. Whereas in the 90s, when you were talking, I was thinking about the Riot Girl movement, which did have a very strong and coherent political agenda, and that actually did get transatlantically transplanted to Eastern Europe with some success. So it seems to me that there is this difference between the 80s without any bigger or more coherent goals, and the 90s with goals that are political. So these are really two questions. One about the commercial element in the 70s and 80s, and the other one about the Riot Girl.
Okay, so basically Malcolm McLaren was a driving force behind the formation of the Sex Pistols, as was his partner at the time, Vivienne Westwood, and it was a commercial project. But the way he did that was with very subversive things in mind, because he was a former situationist. Of course, he wasn't really engaged in the situationist movement that much, but he admired it, and he was basically a situationist wannabe. And he created such slogans as "We're not interested in music, we're interested in chaos," which the members of the Sex Pistols reiterated in interviews. But basically the Sex Pistols were just like a big splash on the commercial music market, and they didn't last long, only about a couple of years. So the way we can look at them is more as an inspiration for the next generation of bands who were just so blown away by the Sex Pistols and the Ramones and the Clash that hundreds and hundreds of kids started their own bands. And these bands had no outlets whatsoever in the mainstream music industry, so they had to create the DIY underground of the 80s, both in England and in the United States, which some of which was very political. For example, Alternative Tentacles by Jello Biafra, that was his record label that he started in California. And these kids were just creating opportunities for themselves. So it was a different generation inspired by this outburst, initial outburst of 77, which is just more like a legendary symbol than it is a real wave of punk, we can say. But you're right that in the 90s, in Poland, the political aspect became more prevalent because there were more and more conflicts with the economic and political transformation of Poland. Issues such as poverty and intolerance were really spreading. The Nazi skinhead movement was a big problem throughout most of the 90s in Poland, and bitter fights and wars were waged between punks and skinheads. So many people who look back on those days, they don't understand why today punks and skinheads can shake hands at shows. It's just impossible for them to accept. So yes, the 90s was even more turbulent, especially in Poland, because while you can say that the 80s was really the Polish decade in any aspect, any historical aspect you can imagine, but for punks, life in the 80s was more like a paradise, you can say, because everything was really simple. You knew who the system was, you basically didn't care about the system, you didn't care about solidarity, and everything was clear, you created your own world, and nobody had anything, so basically everything, you just focused on creating the music, the clothes, and stuff like that. But in the 90s, the conflicts among punks really started in Poland along ideological lines, because of feminism emerging, because of Nazi skinheads, and because of vegetarianism, which were all the dividing lines. So that's just a short answer to your question. Yep.
I was also wondering if does punk always have to be, or maybe if punk can be individual, or is it always somehow, does it need other people, let's say, to work? Does it have to be organized in groups? Because I think you mentioned that often works or focuses around groups of people.
Groups.
So is it dependent on that, or somehow can punk work on the individual?
In isolation?
Yeah, just wondering if it's maybe if isolation, individualism and punk are opposite, on opposite sides.
Well, that's one of the paradoxes of punk here, because you have to be, like, when you are a punk in the 80s, what was underlined, especially among Polish punks, that individualism is really important. You don't want to follow fashions, you don't want to all look the same, you don't want the punk uniform, the leather jacket and the torn jeans and everything. You don't want that. You want to be an individual, total freedom and total self-expression. But on the other hand, the formation of crews was one of the most defining elements of the formation of punk community, because when you were a punk, the way you were recognized as a punk was through recognition of the other people that you worked with. So in practice, it wasn't really conceivable that you just sat at home on your own and listened to records and you declared yourself a punk, because because punks hung out on the streets, they did things together, they walked around with no purpose when there was no shows, and that's how punk communities formed. What's really interesting is, for example, the Czech perspective of the 80s, because of their suppression, their political suppression of cultural expression was much stronger than in Poland in the 80s. And what happened is there were hardly any punk shows in the Czech Republic, well, in Czechoslovakia in the 80s. So what did the punks do? They just hung out together, they walked, they went to the woods together because there was no shows. So for them, being a punk was part of this community. So I hope this answers the question a little bit. Punk in isolation is kind of funny. I guess you can try because it's all about individual freedom and self-expression, but in practice, probably not. Any other questions?
Well, let me just ask you about, first of all, about whether Berlin, West Berlin played any role in all of this, because I mean, it was close, it was easy to get to, relatively speaking, and it wasn't part of the talk, but I wonder if you'd like to say anything about that. And there were, there was a scene there.
Yes, Robert Brylewski, for example, writes about it in his autobiography. I'm not sure if you have that. It's a really thick book called Crisis in Babylon, I believe. It's like a huge interview with him done by Robert Księżyk. And in there, he talks at length about going to West Berlin in the 80s because there was a gap period where it was really easy to get there from Poland. And some of these encounters with the West, especially for the original Warsaw crew, were pretty dramatic because, well, of course they got arrested, they got beaten up by the police there, that's standard, but the long-term consequences sometimes were such as depression or even suicide, because once you came back, the shock was so huge, you had to readjust, I guess, to Polish conditions, and just not being able to live in the West for some of them was too tragic. So there are a few suicides in the original Warsaw punk crew. Some people did manage to escape to the West and live there. For example, Luther was a really seminal member of both the Warsaw and the Gdańsk crews, and he emigrated really quickly in the middle 80s, I believe. But yeah, these encounters were really shocking and important, and Brylewski talks about them. Any other questions? Also, there were ties between Poland and East German punks, especially in the late 80s, through zines and the exchange of goods, such as especially tapes, recorded music, and there were festivals organized that Polish bands went to in East Germany, so this cooperation, I think, is maybe even more relevant. Maybe something about methodology. Are you guys interested in oral history at all? Have you done any oral histories at the center here for any of your classes? Not yet, I guess.
Would you like to tell us about the project that you're now involved with? I mean, would you begin describing to me before this one?
Well, it's a project that I only heard about from Will Glass, who is doing research, and hopefully I'll be able to help him with the project. But it's only stage 2, and they are at stage 1, which is archival research at this point. But he's researching, I forget the name of this really famous American pastor who went to Poland and to the USSR. The name just escapes me, but he was a really famous Baptist preacher. And so Professor Glass is trying to do an oral history in Poland of people who remember this pastor and his visit. So hopefully this will come into fruition. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to talk about that. But some of the other oral history projects that I was involved with when I was working at with my former supervisor at the University in Buffalo. One of the most interesting projects that I did with him was a project about veterans of the Vietnam War era. So most of them went to Vietnam, and just the stories that they had to tell, some of them were just out of this world, really. What they did there with drugs and just to kill time was, it really opens your eyes sometimes when you listen to these stories. But anyway, I think that maintaining oral history collections is the goal for the next generation of oral historians. Like what we do with the audio that is recorded, let's not throw it away, let's not stash it in a drawer, but let's exhibit it in a smart and interesting way. You can exhibit oral history in museums or online is the easiest way, then it's the most accessible. And the problem is just what to do with large history collections. For example, my collection is really big. It's 80-some interviews. And I'm going to put it up on the website, which the link to the website is already in the book. It was supposed to be up a few months ago, but because I'm not an IT specialist or a web designer, it's just really hard to do it on my own. But you will be able to hear clips from the oral history interviews, and there's going to be a photo archive to accompany that from my fieldwork research. So the website should be up sometime by the end of this month, hopefully, fingers crossed. And the link is just polishpunkarchive.org or .pl. And the link is in the book, so if you're interested, you'll find it. But I think it's just really important to put up and make accessible those oral history collections so that the stories aren't lost.
So those are interviews that you conducted with members
For
of that
this
community
project,
in
yeah.
Polish.
Most of them are in Polish. The American interviews are in English.
Right.
So it's going to be a bilingual website, and that's one of the tricks, how to make that work. There's a lot of summaries involved, just to, for those who don't speak Polish, that's going to be a big challenge for me to write it all up. But, yeah.
There's no questions. Thank you very much again.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure to be back here, and I hope I wasn't boring for you. Thank you.